I'll start by introducing the panel, and one of the great qualities of this panel is that we have expertise across really the three most important countries for Australia, which are the US, China and Indonesia. Their expertise goes beyond that, but I think that expertise will shine in the discussion that we have today. So if I can introduce each of you, I'll start with you, Geoff. Geoff Raby was Australia's ambassador to China from 2007 to 11. He's also been ambassador to the WTO and to APEC. He's the author of China's Grand Strategy and Australia's Future in the New Global Order. I have an updated edition there. And Great Game On, the Contest for Central Asia and Global Supremacy. Next along is Bruce. Bruce Wolpe is Senior Fellow at the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. He has worked for the Democrats during Barack Obama's presidency. He was an advisor for Julia Gillard. He has written various books, and his most recent book is What Trump's Second Term Means for Australia, The Shocking Consequences for Us and the World. And Emma Connors is a journalist, writer and editor. She is currently on leave from the Australian Financial Review. She was the Financial Review's Southeast Asia correspondent based in Jakarta and Singapore from 2019 to 2023. And I have to say she also wrote a fantastic essay about Prabowo, the Indonesian president, for Australian Foreign Affairs. So the discussion today, we're going to be looking at the emerging global order and the ways in which the world is changing today. And it is impossible not to centre a discussion like this around Donald Trump and some of the impacts that he's having. And I'm mindful of the fact that that is sort of exactly what Trump wants. Steve Bannon, his advisor, famously said that he floods the zone with shit. And he deliberately has this sort of scattergun approach to leadership, where there's constant announcements, constant distractions, and really part of the aim of that, which is underlined by Bannon's quote, is to avoid any real scrutiny of any of the things that he's doing. So I'm hoping that today we're going to sort of not fall into that trap. And in two ways, really. One is that I'm hoping that we will scrutinise what's important about Trump and the ways that the world is changing under him, and avoid some of the distractions. And the second way is that we're going to be looking at the big picture and some of the big picture developments in the world and the ways that they affect Australia. And so we're going to kind of zoom out from some of Trump's, constant crazy rhetoric to some of the bigger picture changes that his presidency represents. So Bruce, I'm going to start with you. Trump is erratic, he's unpredictable, constantly changing announcements and policies. And I wonder if you can just try and draw out a consistent thread from that. What is his worldview? How does he see the US role in the world? And if you can also include in that, how does he view China?
Wow. It's terrific to be here. I mean, to be with Emma and Geoff and you, Jonathan, is really fantastic. And Words on the Waves, congratulations to them for this book festival. It's really a stunning achievement, and it's great. Now, I didn't want to be here. I wanted to be put out of business, but Kamala lost the election. But I'm here. I think the departure point really is what kind of world we're in, and a couple of things. First, America is no longer the leader of the free world. That's over. And secondly, the structure of commercial relations among the nations of the world is gone. The trading system that has existed since the end of World War II, 75 years of it, has been dismantled. And so those two things fundamentally changed the world. And then I thought Jared Baker of the Wall Street Journal really captured in one sentence what Trump is doing. Trump has set aside values, ideals, alliances, and partnerships in favor of U.S. economic, commercial, and national security goals. And that's what he's doing. He's not, exercising power and leadership through values and principles. It's just what's good for the United States. And he has 4 isms. He has protectionism, isolationism, nativism, and America first, nationalism. And anything that he does falls in those baskets. So today, he goes to Pittsburgh to talk about Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel, and the companies are going to get together. We still don't know who's going to own a majority of the company. And he unilaterally said, well, those steel tariffs, I'm taking them to 50%. Australia's hit directly today. And so he's out there. So that's the world we're in, and we're in a world where America is attacking its allies, Canada, Greenland, Denmark, and then he's cozying up to the adversaries, Putin, Xi. And I can't wait till he gets to Kim Jong-un in North Korea.
Just on China, if we could just stay with you, Bruce, what do you think he wants from the relationship with China?
Yeah, we were talking earlier, China, the other thing is Trump has not concluded anything that he said he would do. Gaza is still raging. Ukraine is still raging. There are no trade deals yet. So this is all underway. And what he wants.
How does he see China, and what kind of relationship does he want with China?
Yeah, we were talking earlier that he hasn't gotten to China yet. I mean, I think he's teeing it up. I think China wants one thing overwhelmingly, but Geoff has deferred to him completely. They want Taiwan, and Trump wants the best trade deal that he can possibly ever get, the most historic trade deal from his interests out of China. So how you reconcile those two things, that's an open question.
Yeah, Geoff, what is the view from Beijing with Trump in power? How are they seeing things? How's Xi Jinping seeing things? And is he seeing this as an opportunity for China, given the US is supposed to be making America great again, but in many ways undermining that ambition? Is Xi Jinping sensing opportunity?
Yeah, thanks. And if I could just echo Bruce's comments, and thanks to the organisers. Fabulous being here. Great. Never been on a panel watching guys surfing. It's a great way to spend the afternoon. I'm enjoying it immensely. Look, I just want to say something about Trump, which segues into your question about China. And that is, we need to be a bit careful we don't just put everything on Trump, because then it creates a sense that if Trump disappears in 4 years, we're back to the status quo ex ante. And that's not going to happen, right? And Biden's interregnum between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0 is very, very instructive. Trump 1.0 trashed the WTO, didn't appoint appellate body judges, put illegal and unjustified tariffs on not only China, but mainly China. And what did Biden do when he got in? Nothing. He could have rebuilt the core global rules-based institution, the WTO, simply by joining the global consensus or membership consensus to appoint new appellate body judges. As simple as that. He did nothing. And he didn't repeal any of the tariffs of Trump 1.0. So what this says to me, and Bruce is the expert, not me, but what it says to me as an outsider looking on, is something profound and structural has changed in the US. And I think, segueing now to China and your question, Jonathan, is that the Chinese figured this out a long time ago. So since Trump 1.0, they've been building resilience. And it's resilience not just against the then improbable comeback of Trump, but against the US, which no longer is going to continue to play the same role in global affairs as it has. And China has prepared itself for tariffs. It's prepared itself for many of the things Trump has foreshadowed and is probably going to do one day when he gets around to it. They've reallocated industry to other low-wage areas of the world. They've worked very hard to build strong standing and support amongst what's today called the Global South. When I was a boy at university, it was called the developing world or the third world. But China has been unfolding a very thought out and very consistent set of responses in the eventuality of Trump 2.0, but actually for managing a United States, which is vastly different than the one of 10, 15, 20 years ago. How does she view Trump? Well, I don't talk very much about she, and some of you who follow my writing will realise that, because she's just the head of an institution called the Chinese Communist Party, and that's the biggest party in the world, 93 million people, I think, at last count, and it exists to perpetuate itself. So anything that threatens the rule of the Communist Party, including a crazy leader of the party, won't be tolerated. What the Chinese leadership and the party abhor is uncertainty, instability, and Trump brings them all of that. But on the other hand, Trump also does not understand and doesn't care about US exceptionalism. And US exceptionalism is a continuous strand through US foreign policy for the last century and longer. And what that means is the US had to be the primary power in the world. Well, Trump doesn't care about that either. And it's fascinating, as Bruce said. He's turned to the Western Hemisphere as much as anything else. You know, making Canada the 51st state, taking over Greenland, taking back the Panama Canal. His agenda is very much an early 19th century agenda when the US was establishing its hegemony over the Western Hemisphere. So for the Chinese, I think they see a real opportunity here. Trump's not going to talk to them about human rights, about issues like Xinjiang and Tibet, Hong Kong, and Taiwan is an ongoing issue and a very moot one, and we can talk about that a bit more at length. But just to finish my remarks now, I don't think the Chinese are that worried about Trump. They probably see opportunity in the way the US has fundamentally and structurally changed. And there is a possibility, because China's the ascendant power and the US is the dominant power, if you think of this in great power geopolitical terms, there is, I think, I'm fairly sanguine to some extent, without, I hope, being polyanderish, that there is an opportunity now with Trump for an accommodation between the great powers.
Emma, what about stepping just outside China for a moment to the rest of the world? How are other important powers like the EU, Japan, Indonesia, do you see, how are they responding to this new transactionalist US, and do you see any trends to the way they're responding?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to watch the progress over the last few months. So I think initially there was sort of the rush to pay homage at Mar-a-Lago. Everyone was following the example of the then Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was thought to have dealt very effectively with Trump 1.0 when he went to Mar-a-Lago, played golf, ate hamburgers, and managed to convince Trump that Japan's national interests were aligned with America's. So we did see a bit of a Congo line, but more recently there's been this sort of stiffening of resolve, I think, and it sort of chimes nicely with some of the less respectful shaping of the Trump presidency. You may have heard of the taco trade. So people are now realising that, Trump, as Bruce said, it's not what he says, it's what he does, and we're still waiting for him to do a lot of the trade stuff. So we're seeing some interesting alliances form. Just yesterday, French President Emmanuel Macron was in Singapore, opening the Shangri-La dialogue, and spoke of possibility of European and Asian alliance against coercive powers, which was directed at both the US and China. This was at the end of a 6-day tour by Macron from the region. So he went to Vietnam, Indonesia, and then Singapore, and spoke in all of those about strengthening links with those countries. Vietnam in particular has been really not for six by Trump. He wants to put 46% tariffs, and they have a huge trade with the States. So they are still in the give him what he wants stage. They've cleared the way for new golf courses for his chosen areas and the rest. But I think the one to watch is India. So Narendra Modi and Trump have a lot in common. They're both ultra-nationalists. They're both big believers in protectionism. You know, India has never seen a tariff it didn't like, I think. You know, it's repeatedly refused to join in trade agreements. So now we have the fascinating prospect of India and the US trying to negotiate a free trade deal. And it'll be really interesting to see where that lands. But I think generally it's just interesting to see this switch from purely defensive against Trump to more offensive.
Bruce, what about Australia? What do you think Trump this term has meant for Australia, and how should Australia be responding?
I think in terms of this discussion, the most important thing is for Australia to continue and redouble again the foreign policy initiatives undertaken by Albanese and Penny Wong in the first term here, which was simply to strengthen and flesh out more of the concentric circles of relationships that Australia has in the region. It has to be Australia's national interest first, and then the question is, how do you get there? And you have APEC and you have ASEAN and all kinds of collateral organizations that bring the countries together. What's interesting is when China sits down to talk to Asia, it's just China and those countries. When Australia sits down, it's Australia and half a dozen countries on Australia's side to sit down and talk about things. So if the money's invested, so it's both hard power and soft power, people to people, it's trade. In an age where free trade is in retreat, build more free trade agreements. We're already doing it with the EU. It's the perfect compensation to what Trump is doing with his tariffs against Australia and others in the world. So I think, and I do think in anticipation that Trump would return, a lot of that planning has been done, and I think they're executing on it, and I think it's very smart.
What about, Geoff, I'll ask you this, on the sort of security front. On the one hand, you know, there's been great anxiety in Australia in recent years about China and China's rise. And Australia now has anxieties about the US under Trump. But so far, really, Australia has been committing even more strongly to its military alliance with the US. You know, we've seen AUKUS, we've seen more and more stationing of hardware and potential stationing of US hardware in Australia. Do you think that's the right... Well, what do you think about the anxieties that we have about China? And do you think that that's the right response?
Well, I think Trump has created a huge dilemma for Australian foreign and security policy. Don't forget that since the British dumped us in 1942 in Singapore and didn't guarantee our security when Japan invaded, and we swung to the United States, since 1942 we have had at the heart of our foreign and security policies an untested, unproven assumption that the US will always be there in our time of need. Now, in the 1960 emergency in Indonesia, that actually wasn't the case. The Americans did not support the Australian position with respect to Indonesia and decolonisation. So I think we have based our security and foreign policy on a very thin reed, but it's so powerful in Canberra. The thinking is so ingrained and so much part of the working assumption. What Trump has done, though, and I think it's a good thing, it's actually making Australia question that. So at the end of March, Bruce and I were in a conference organised by former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull in Canberra. A whole range, from the Hawkish to the Dovish, all views were there.
Who knew Malcolm could bring so many people together?
If there was one landing point in the whole thing, it was that we can no longer just assume that the US is a reliable ally. And that's a profound shock to thinking in Canberra. So in that sense, I think Trump is very helpful. But where I think he creates an enormous dilemma, to your point on security, Jonathan, is that, as James Curran says, I think says it so well in his columns in the AFR, Australian foreign policy is conducted with a forked tongue. So we talked a big game about, our securities in Asia. We want to work with regional neighbours, all the sorts of concentric circles and things that Bruce was alluding to. But the reality is, and this is seen and understood in Asia, all our actions have been, up until now, to glue ourselves ever more tightly to the hip of the United States. AUKUS, elevating the Quad to summit level, and so on. And that is a big dilemma for Canberra. And I don't think in many ways the memo has reached Canberra yet that Trump is president. You don't see any realisation of that in Canberra at this stage. Now, there's been an election, and clearly, China's been the security has been something that neither party wanted to get into, and Labor's desperately keen never to be wedged on. But as I said on an ABC radio interview sometime during the election with Penny Wong, it's as if China is the name you shall not speak. You shall not utter. It's just extraordinary that we went through an election campaign virtually pretending China didn't exist, and all the challenges and things that it raises for us. So I think we have a big problem, and I think we need to find a way of working through that. And I don't think for Australia there are any easy, there's no easy path from where we are now at present.
Do you think, this is for any of you really, I mean, what do you think, do you think that Canberra is going to embed itself even more closely with the US as these sort of anxieties rise, or do you think that it's going to start to distance itself from Trump? I mean, Emma, do you want to answer that?
So I don't know about certainly overtly distancing ourselves from the US, but boy, a lot of people in Asia would be very relieved to see a different approach from Australia. If you look at so many Asian countries, they'll talk about China and the need to recognise China as a great civilization. It's always dominated Asia, thousands of years. I think they look at us and think, what, have you only just woken up to this? They just can't understand how we deal with this so badly. We're in a bull in a china shop. Come out going, China rising, China rising. And Indonesia's sitting there going, yeah, well, they've been doing that for quite some time now, and, we've managed. So if you look at Indonesia, for example, the Chinese fishing boats come every year, usually after Christmas, to that bottom bit of the South China Sea that the Indonesians call the Natuna waters. And every year, Indonesia sends up Navy boats and the Chinese fishing boats go away. And they know that this is what they have to do. It's a game they play. China's stretching its muscles. Indonesia comes back. Everyone has their say, and then it goes back. And it's a way of hedging and recognising real politics that Australia could learn a lot from. And instead, we stand up with bloody Union Jack flags and talk about and look to our past history, to our links with Britain and the US, rather than looking forward and rather than taking cognizance of where we are in the world's geography, which is in Asia.
I think we need a national conversation on this. It's being dealt with in the public arena as a piecemeal. Something happens on trade, there's some reactions and stuff like that. And I think that we need to, the United States is still called the great ally of Australia in these days. It's not anymore. Look at Prime Minister Carney in Canada. He said, the alliance with the United States is over. Those days are over. We have a different course to chart. Let's do it. And I think we need that discussion. I think the memo did arrive in Canberra, but I think there are differing degrees of paying attention to it because people are scared to get out there. But that's what we have a prime minister for, to get out and lay out the consequences of Australia and its policy and where we're going to go. And I think that would be very helpful in taking us to a new level of understanding. So we're not just taking stuff from the United States and reacting piecemeal to it, but we have a comprehensive policy. This is us. This is what we stand for. We have values. We believe in democracy. We want to further them. We're looking for security. This is who we're going to work with. Here are the conditions. And let's just go.
Yeah, I agree with all that, Bruce, and sure. I mean, And that goes to the point that it's very, very hard for Canberra to move from where it is, very hard. But Emma, that was a great presentation, and your point about us looking at our past. I just want to say to the audience, look, next time you see a senior Australian official, or usually it's politicians, or Joe Hockey, when he was our ambassador in Washington, never tired of starting every single speech with the statement that Australia has been in every war with the United States for the past century. In other words, he's saying how dumb we are, how stupid we've been. And honestly, the best thing that's happened to us is J.D. Vance, who said that the US has spent 40 years in useless, destructive, costly wars and achieved nothing. Do not forget that. In Canberra, you try and say that, and people will dismiss you as a nutter. Just as well we have a bigger nutter like J.D. Vance to reference now.
Geoff, you talked about Penny Wong not mentioning China. What would you like the government, how would you like the government to reframe for the public its approach to China? What should the public understanding of China be?
Well, it's interesting. Whilst Penny Wong seems to be neuralgic about the word China, Albanese is not bad. I thought during the election, and a couple of times China came up, he would always preface what he said about China with the factual statement that China is our largest trading partner, and the other factual statement that our prosperity depends on China. Now, that's not a bad place to start. And I think instead of the China threat, we should talk much more about the China opportunity, but of course never resile from identifying and acknowledging the differences in values and in systems and so on. And like the neighbours in Southeast Asia, recognise the inevitability, the reality of China's rise, that it is a great power in the region, and just get on with working out how to manage it. We're not going to contain it, we're not going to hold it back, but we have a lot of countries we can work with that can raise the cost to China of bad behaviour, and that's what we should be doing. But in a context of a positive framing of the conversation, so we talk and think more about opportunity than about threats.
I mean, Emma, why do you think we don't see things that way here? Why has the conversation gone the other way?
It's interesting if you compare our discussions about China with how China is viewed and discussed in countries like, Vietnam, which has a huge, shares a border with China, has huge trade, but also has a lot of territorial disputes. And, I was told when I was there that the Vietnamese don't want Chinese investment in offshore wind because, who knows what else they'll put in those windmills type thing. So I think we have to learn how to operate a multi-layered approach rather than sort of just rushing in and going, oh my God, there's Chinese warships in the Tasman Sea. It's like, well, it's a big sea, as Geoff said, it's not really that surprising. But the one thing I think that is an interesting example of this different approach is ASEAN, which is not the world's most exciting or thrilling diplomatic body, 10 Southeast Asian countries that operate on a policy of non-interference with each other's affairs, and this thing called ASEAN centrality, which I eventually realised means they want all inquiries from outside countries to go through ASEAN, that has absolutely nothing to do with ASEAN acting as a bloc in any way. But ASEAN has been negotiating a code of conduct with China in the South China Sea for at least 20 years. And as you'll know from the skirmishes with the Philippine warships, these negotiations have not stopped any of these territorial disputes. But each side, each participant, each of those ASEAN countries and China regard these discussions as a success because they're all still talking. So this is an Asian approach to diplomacy that is very much at odds with the Australian, where's the result? Where's the deal? And I think we could learn a lot.
Just if I could amplify that, it's very well put. I lived in Beijing for 20 years, 5 years in the 80s to the early 90s, and then 15 years from 2007 when I went there as ambassador, and then I worked as a businessman for most of the time. And the one thing you get to understand, to Emma's point, is that the Chinese, it's not just the Indonesians or the Vietnamese, the Chinese can comfortably live with ambiguity. But we can't. We need to have a black and white outcome to everything. And that's why I'm personally somewhat relaxed, although there are real risks, about the China-Taiwan issue. Because all sides of that issue can live with ambiguity.
Well, let's talk about Taiwan. Bruce, what do you think Trump's view of Taiwan is?
I think Trump sees the great value. Well, it's all material things. It's where the chips are. Who controls the chips? Are they going to come to the United States and fuel America's economy? In strategic terms, I mean, it seems to me that Trump is very squeamish about going to war. He doesn't like mess. He doesn't like what he's seeing in Gaza. He called off a strike in Syria because he was afraid he was going to kill some people in the strike. And he's very tepid about it. I think he does not want a major war with China. I think what he wants is to extract other things that will benefit the United States and its economy. So, but we see Xi, at least if they're still somewhat tempered about it, at least the picture that he's projecting is we need it, we're going to have it, it's ours, one China, and we're going to get it in 2027, 2028. And so people are assuming that he makes that real. So how do you live with that? There is in the United States a very strong hostile to China wing of the Republican Party in particular. So if Trump goes down a road of appeasement, I think there will be real serious pushback on that. So there's a lot to manage in the internal politics and the external strategic.
I think you need to ask yourself also, where are these people who say that China must have Taiwan by 2027? I can assure you, no one in Beijing talks about Taiwan. And they don't talk about Australia either. The only time in the last, particularly under Morrison, that people talked about Australia to me, they would ask me, why is it that Australia is the only country in the world that's worried about war with Taiwan? That's because we had our Prime Minister and our Minister every second day talking about the inevitability of war. In China, Taiwan doesn't matter. Okay, it does matter in a historical sense. It does matter to Xi. Xi would love to have it back. But the Communist Party's not going to blow itself up with some risky adventure into Taiwan. They will, over a long period of time, seek to strangle Taiwan through grey area measures and all sorts of other things, cyber, you name it. But Taiwan's also proven over the last 50, 60 years very capable at resisting all of that. So I think, again, it's one of these issues that probably gets much higher prominence in the West, and particularly in the US and in Canberra, than it certainly doesn't in China, that's for sure.
I mean, Australia's concerns about China, Emma, are changing our relations with countries in the region. Can you talk a little bit about that? Which countries is Australia starting to see as partners?
Well, look, I think there have been some encouraging developments in recent years, particularly with Indonesia, which, you know, it's so puzzling, Australia's relationship with Indonesia. It's so close, and it's our favourite tourist destination. More Australians go to Bali than go to New Zealand, but many of them don't realise that Bali is actually part of Indonesia. And Indonesia it's a wonderful place. The people are fantastic. Which is why people like going to Bali, partly. But there is so much potential for Australia there, and there's also a lot of goodwill towards Australia, but increasingly that goodwill is becoming sort of a historical fact. You know, Indonesians regard Australia with some affection, but a bit of bemusement, and we're being left behind. Indonesia is growing fast. It's a country of more than 200 million people. Southeast Asia as a whole is the fastest growing region in the world. You know, things are happening fast, moving quickly. And when you are there, you will see a lot of European investment. You'll see a lot of American investment, of course, a lot of Japanese investment, but you will rarely see any Australian. It's like when I first went there, I was talking to an Indonesian minister who said, yes, it seems both of us are looking north to China and we don't look at each other. Albanese has tried to change this. You know, he corralled a group of superannuation funds and took them up to Indonesia and took them all around. They were introduced to a new sort of government investment body that's been set up. Dutch pension funds have invested in this investment body, and the Australian superannuation fund managers sort of, you know, smiled a bit and then came home again. And I was talking to an American investor soon after they were there, and he said, Australian fund managers are the laziest in the world. Which is probably slightly harsh, but I do think it shows that because Indonesia is a very different country to Australia, majority Muslim, sort of capitalist, but also sort of not. You know, the government at all levels is very involved in every enterprise. So we find it difficult to understand, so we put it in the too hard basket, which is, you know, we are going to lose out much more than Indonesia will, I think. You know, we still sort of regard investment in Indonesia as a bit of foreign aid, but it's so not true. And I think in a way, that is one of the great sadnesses I have, really, is that we understand and have such little interest in this immense and promising country.
Do you think Indonesia's obviously got a new president? Do you think?
Yeah, he's fascinating. So, Prabowo Subianto was elected last year, and he took over from Joko Widodo, also known as Jokowi, who was served for 2 terms. Jokowi was, you know, he wasn't comfortable on the world stage. If he could avoid going to a G20 meeting, he would. His English wasn't great, but he was also just much more focused on Indonesia, whereas Prabowo is much more of a man of the world. He spent a lot of time in America. He has a very interesting, somewhat checkered past. For a long time, he was banned from entering Australia and America due to some kidnappings that happened in East Timor around the time when he was a military commander. This was his 4th try at president, and you could hardly recognise the candidate in each election. He's very worldly, he's very interested in Australia, he's very well inclined towards Australia, but he's also a really fiery, a little bit unpredictable. So I think we're going to have to, it's going to be a real relationship to watch, that one.
Bruce, Albanese and Trump haven't actually met yet, but they will soon. What advice would you give to Anthony Albanese?
Talk straight to Trump. There are 2 models. There's the King Charles Starmer model, and then there is the Carney model. And I think as Trump does more and more things that are harmful to Australia's interests, and really hostile, that the Prime Minister should be very direct with him. This is not how you treat an ally. This is not how you treat a friend. We don't deserve it, and we're not going to take it. And now let's talk about some stuff. So I think he should do that. I thought when I wrote my first book on Trump and Australia, it was the part of the writing I really enjoyed most. It was a fantasy sequence of what Trump was thinking when he would first meet with Albanese. I don't like your hair, don't like your glasses, don't like the suit. You don't look like a prime minister, you know, that sort of thing. And you're a labor. I mean, I hate labor unions. You know what I do to labor unions? So I think it could be, their phone calls have been good as reported by both, but there will be a moment, I mean, Trump has an intense ability to assess who he's talking to and make a decision about what their weak point is and go after it and hammer it home to try and destroy them. And I think Trump will figure that out very quickly, and I think Albanese has to be ready.
Emma's given us really fascinating insight into how we're viewed in our own region. I wonder, Bruce and Geoff, I'm going to ask you both how you think we're viewed in Washington and Beijing at the moment. Geoff, I'll start with you. How do you think China views Australia?
Well, as I said, China doesn't think much about Australia at all. When they do, they see us for what we are, a very rusted-on ally to the United States as a country that does the US bidding in the region. I think they are hopeful the relationship could be more than that, and they would hope that we could be used in the relationship in a way that would probably help to increase understanding in Washington around China. Whether that's possible, I'm not saying a bridge, but just as an interlocutor that's engaged. What I think we've lost track of in Australia, though, is that we had a lot of capacity in the past to do things. We created APEC. We led the Cambodian peace settlement. We established, jointly with Indonesia, but we did all the work, the regional people smuggling arrangements. We did a lot of stuff. And when I first went to Beijing as ambassador in 2007, Chinese Foreign Ministry often said to me, what's happened to Australia? Where are you these days? We used to, this is the Chinese speaking, we used to look to Australia to do things in the region that we can't do. Because we, the Chinese, if ever we try and do something, other great powers, we know who they're talking about, stop us and block us. And so Australia has a very critical role in doing these things. And I think we could get back to that. And I think instead of talking about China threat, we could also talk about points where we can cooperate with China and where we can jointly lead regional initiatives, which I think would be enormously well received in ASEAN and elsewhere in the region. Things like we are the region, or we're the world's biggest energy exporter, and China is the world's biggest energy importer. And why we have never begun a dialogue on energy and climate change is beyond me. We live the most dangerous part of the world, and yet we don't have a regional security mechanism. And it's beyond me to understand why Australia has never done what it used to do and lead on some of these discussions and build coalitions and use its diplomacy. So that would give us real value to China and real profile, but we just seem to have given up the game.
Emma, just quickly on that point, do you think there would be openness in the region to Australia playing a more activist role?
Oh, yeah, most definitely. When I said earlier that Australia is regarded with affection, I think it was based, the memory of those actions with APEC and Cambodia, we were seen as a can-do, and, everyone loves Australians. We're likeable people. So we've got that going in our favour. But now we're seeing, new economy emerges. Indonesia's trying to start up an EV and looking to Australia for export of lithium. But at the minute, it's very difficult for Indonesians even to get a visa to come here. So there's a lot of things we could do, to encourage more interaction with the region, and there would be that would be very welcome. Yeah, definitely.
Bruce, I just wanted to come back to you on how do you think Trump and the Trump White House views Australia?
I think at the level below the Oval Office, because of the historical ties of going into every war together over a century, the ties are excellent. And I think Vance gets it. I think Rubio gets it, but particularly the intelligence community, the Pentagon and the Defense Forces here, they've worked together for decades. They trust each other. So I think those relationships are there. But I do think that they realize, and we have a new head of intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, which is a wild card, and how she interprets the world will influence Trump and how he sees the world, and that is very uncertain territory. I do think that I do think Trump will he has changed policy. We're going to react to the change policy, and we're going to be in a different relationship. With respect to China, I think China's appreciative that on the trade stuff, Australia stood up a little bit and said no, and because, Trump would like Australia to say the same things on trade that he's saying in order to make China capitulate as to Trump's demands. That's not going to happen, and I think that's appreciated. The U.S. is, we were in a deep freeze with China 5-6 years ago. We're completely out of that. It's almost a normal relationship. There is a flashpoint now with the Port of Darwin and how that goes. That's a real irritant right now. If that can be navigated successfully, that would be really good for Australia.
We're going to have questions in a couple of minutes, so I might just ask a question to each of you. Quick question about the future before we turn to questions. I'll ask about in Indonesia, China, and the US. I'm just interested in some of the maybe worrying trends that we've seen in some of those in those countries, whether there might be a change. So, for instance, Geoff, if we start with China, I mean, we've seen centralised power. We've seen Xi Jinping is effectively dictator for life if he wants to be. Growing sort of domestic repressiveness. Is that a trend that's going to continue? Where do you see the future of China domestically?
Who knows? The amazing thing about China is it is at the elite political level as opaque as it's ever been since 1949. And it's very, very difficult to peer into that. I'd say this, though. On one hand, you could think of a high degree of stability, but never underestimate the extent to which there is dynamic politics in China. And so we've been in a more authoritarian phase in the last dozen years or so. It's not just because of Xi Jinping. I think this is where the media gets this so wrong. The party itself recognised that things were starting to fall apart. And they needed discipline and they needed to tighten up. Now, maybe Xi's overdone it. Of course, he's used anti-corruption campaign to see off opponents and for political ends. But I think the institution's very strong and very stable. However, Xi will have to be replaced. And like all authoritarian systems, there's only 3 ways you can replace the leader. You can do it by dynastic succession, as in North Korea. You can do it by entropy, like in Russia. You just let the leader die, and the whole thing just runs into the ground in that process. Or you do it violently. And it looked as if China under Deng Xiaoping, or the immediate period after him, had pulled off a great trick. Without any rules or regulations, they had seemed to have decided that the alternatives to a predictable regular succession was chaos, and they didn't want that. But with Xi doing away with the understanding, it was no more than an understanding that a leader would serve 2 terms, then it's back to a Leninist system. So there are your only 3 options. Interestingly enough, I'll stop at this point, but I do point out that with Mao's succession, they did all 3 at once. There was the wife Jiang Qing trying to do succession within the family. There was Mao was entropy, dying on the spot, and Deng Xiaoping brought the palace guard in and took over. So, maybe it's all 3, but there is a significant degree of political risk at the moment of transition for China, and that would be the biggest unknown for me at this stage.
Emma, where do you see Indonesia going?
So Indonesia is still quite a young democracy. There's only been popular elections for the president since 2004. There is some concern about developments that happened under Jokowi's reign, where he weakened the Commission Against Corruption, and he also started off saying, I don't want a family dynasty, and then decided to go the way of most other Southeast Asian countries and quite like the idea of a family dynasty, and now his son is vice president. So that, but I do think we have to be a bit careful in applying our standards of democracy to Indonesia. I would say, after having been there for the last election, that Indonesians love voting, they love elections, they love the fact that they have their say, and they would not give that up without a huge fight. And Australia has a habit of worrying about Indonesia. it did have admittedly terrible times in the 60s and the 90s, but unless there is a big economic downturn, I think the country is on a good path.
Bruce, let's end with America. What happens after Trump?
Where Trump is he's in command and out of control at the same time. And he is an authoritarian. He does not believe, he has no respect for the norms of governance, the informal rules that keep a democracy. He's not legislating much. He does have one big, beautiful bill that's pending. We'll see if the Republicans hang together to pass it. That's big tax cuts, more money for the border, and get rid of clean energy and a whole bunch of other stuff. And that's important, but he's doing everything by executive order. Again, he is very canny and cunning. It's called flooding the zone. Every day, a fire hose is sprayed over the country with a dozen executive orders that trigger 100 policies that lead to affecting millions of people. And to absorb it and understand it and then try and prioritize, how do we handle that? And then he is the master of media coverage. He sucks all the oxygen out of every television set in the country. He's on television 3 to 4 hours a day. Just today, the press conference with Elon Musk, that ran for an hour. And then he goes to Pittsburgh and makes a speech on trade. That's another hour and a half. And it's covered live on Fox News. So it's complete dominance. The tragedy for the Democrats, yes, losing the presidency was a tragedy, is that they couldn't keep control of the House of Representatives because there is no accountability. Trump controls the White House, the House, and the Senate. The House and the Senate are not going to come against him and start issuing subpoenas to explain what's going on here, or holding hearings, or embarrassing him. There's an infirmity in the American system. There's no opposition leader. There's a leader of the House, a leader of the Senate, but they haven't even gotten together to hold a press conference every morning at 10 a.m. and say, here are the 5 atrocities Trump has committed since the sun came up this morning, and this is what we're going to do about it. That does not occur. And so we were talking about this earlier. Democrats at the grassroots are furious. They're angry as hell, but there's no representation in Washington to translate that into something. So the party is kind of eating itself as Trump is chewing on the real meat in the country and really enjoying every bite. So it's, there's one thing that people have talked about, is there going to be a constitutional crisis in the country because he acts contrary to law? I think that the case from a couple days ago, that the tariffs that he imposed, the so-called Liberation Day tariffs, are unconstitutional. I think that's a very strong case. I'm not a lawyer. I read the opinion. It looked great to me. And that is going to go up to the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court upholds the lower court's ruling that he had no basis for establishing Liberation Day tariffs because you can't do it under that law, and they say, so thou shalt not, that will then be a moment of truth for Trump saying, oh, yes, I can. And if that happens, all hell's going to break loose. I really like to end on an up note.
Well, maybe some of the questions will lead us there. Does anyone have any questions?
Oh, there's no surprise, John. There's lots of questions. Hello, everyone. I went to New Caledonia a while ago now, and after we got back, there was an uprising, and a wild card ended up being behind it, being Azerbaijan. I'm wondering if you have any view on Central Asia. I think you touched on that earlier, and what's going on there, or is that just too obscure?
Geoff can answer that.
My new book's on Central Asia, but not Azerbaijan. But in a nutshell, what's happened is that Putin's crazy, immoral invasion of Ukraine has really damaged Russian standing in Central Asia at a time when China has been, for 20 years, gradually expanding its influence. It's been expanding its influence, obviously, through trade and investment, and it's a dominant force in the region, economically, commercially. The Belt and Road Initiative was launched in Astana in Kazakhstan in October 2013. Clearly, that was a big part of it. The Trans-Eurasian rail links, which are just continuing to multiply and multiply. All of this builds Chinese influence, standing. But up until the invasion of Ukraine, it was more or less an equal partnership between Russia and China. But with the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's had to move massive amounts of resources from the east. It no longer can be seen as a security guarantor for Central Asia, but more than that, it's alarmed and alerted Central Asia to the Putin doctrine that if you have a sizable majority of ethnic Russians in your country, it's legitimate to invade. And that's a big problem for Kazakhstan because 25% of the population are Russian, ethnically Russian, less so for some of the others. But the other thing is that what it's done, and it's fascinating, is it's led to an increasing questioning in Central Asia of Russian colonialism from the 19th century, but particularly from the Soviet period, when they were forced to become republics in the Soviet Union, and they had to speak Russian. Their local language, customs, religion, all of that was suppressed by Stalin and under the Soviet Union. And there's a cultural resurgence going on. All of that substantially weakens Russia. Meanwhile, the Chinese, who don't have to press their advantage, are behind the scenes making sure that this momentum and these trends keep going, all of which plays to China's strategic objective, which has become the dominant power in Eurasia, and it's working and worked.
What about Azerbaijan?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about Azerbaijan, but
I think
I preface my comments by saying that I don't know about Azerbaijan very much, but it's like Moldova and a couple of those other states are in a very vulnerable position vis-a-vis Russia.
We have a question here, thank you.
I've really enjoyed hearing you three. It's been fascinating. My question is, as you point out, China's managing its place in the world with great aplomb compared with the major democracy in the world, which is not. I want to live in a democracy. What do you think is the future for democracy in the world? Because at the moment it's looking shaky.
I'd like both of you to comment on democracy in the world. I want to say this about democracy in Australia. This is one of the strongest democracies in the world. We cannot have a blow-in like Trump become Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is the leader of the majority party in the House of Representatives. We have an Australian Electoral Commission that is nonpartisan, and the person who registers to vote here it does the same process as someone in the furthest reaches of First Nations territory in the north. We have, you don't have appointees to the Supreme Court who come before the Senate and are asked questions about how they stand on abortion. You have a head of the Reserve Bank of Australia who doesn't come before the Senate and is asked, what are you going to do on interest rates? We also have, and this is one thing I love in common with the Communist Party of China, compulsory voting. Fantastic. And that ensures, with preferences, ensures you're going to be center left or center right. So there are all these threats to our futures, but Australia's democracy is going to be okay. It's going to survive Trump, and it's going to be better than ever.
If I could just add a footnote to that, very well said, Bruce, of course. Something I used to write about a lot, where in the height of the so-called China threat a few years ago, is that the China threat proponents undervalue the strength of our institutions. Our institutions, as Bruce has just laid out, are very, very strong. And of course, China's not the only state interfering in Australia. The United States is the master of interference in Australia, followed by Israel and many other states, including Malta, which manages to make us still have an embassy in Malta, but that's another story. But my point is our institutions are very, very strong, and the Peter Harchers and people like that have us falling prey to China any day now really undervalue the strength of our system. And we need the Prime Minister and other senior ministers to be reminding Australians of just how solidly based we are and how secure we are with our institutions.
Just very briefly, there were other elections last year, including India's, the world's largest democracy, and that had a surprising result in that Narendra Modi's party lost its majority in the legislature, which no one expected, but a lot of civic rights groups worked very hard, and it was really a resounding win for democracy. And I think when you're in country, reporting on countries with elections, democracy is way ahead.
We have one question here, sir.
my question was, do you think a longer term of Parliament would make us better equipped to face the, or give us greater opportunities in the world of today?
Yes.
Bring on the fixed term.
Some decent politicians would help.
I think we only have time for one more question, so I turn this gentleman down here.
Your references to APEC and Peter Hartcher bring us inevitably to Paul Keating. You seem to be in broad agreement with him. He's been quite scathing about AUKUS, quite dismissive about fears of threats from China, and of course he's well known for wanting to, while he was Prime Minister, immerse us in Southeast Asia much more. And I might add that what was apparent in those days when we started becoming, or the teaching of Indonesian in Australian schools became quite common, which is one indication of that. Do you lament his the change of policy that occurred when he lost office?
Yeah, look, there's a lot to unpack there, but short answer is that, let me give you a personal answer. I joined the government in 1984, and I've spent the best part of 40 years on an agenda to open Australia, liberalise Australia, integrate Australia into the Asian region. And the foreign languages, the study of Asian languages says how much we've failed. Because today we've gone so far backwards from where we were. And I find it astonishing how few Australians, children, are studying another Asian language.
I have one thing to add on Paul Keating. When Julia lost her office in the vote in Parliament, one of the first callers was Paul Keating, and he says, "You know, love, you always get taken out in a box."
I think our time is up. So one more question, panel. Can you have one more question? There you go.
In reading some Asian commentators or Southeast Asian commentators about China on the web, a number of them, or some of them that I've seen at least, are tending to emphasise more in recent years that there's a Confucian element, so-called, in the attitude of governance towards governance in China. Do you think that that's a real thing, or is this merely a sort of whitewashing? Is there anything real going on there where we can see that the Communist Party might in fact be the current inheritors of the literati of the past and so on?
Just a quick one, because we're running out of time, but the short answer is yes, they're doing it. Xi Jinping is very much pushing this. Its objective is not really to rehabilitate Confucius as such, but to find ways of legitimising Communist Party rule.
And I think you said one more question over there. Was there?
Just a quick question. If the canvas so bad, what I hear, Umina hasn't arrived, we're not taking the role we should be in Asia. How do we change that?
Look, I think I am positive. I think we were speaking earlier about what good might flow from Trump, and I think this Trump 2.0 could gently push boats that were already floating in terms of Australia becoming more engaged and directed in Asia, and really more Australia as Australia rather than Australia as America's ally in Asia.
And I think these are leadership issues, and I think the bureaucracy gets signals from who's leading. So what you want are people entering politics who have a sense of purpose and care about the future of the country, instead of just a sense of ego and they want to be famous. And the more that are populated with purpose, the better off it is. The bureaucracy can absolutely rise, but they need to be really well cooked.
And they can also read the new edition of my book, China's Grand Strategy, which Jonathan will kindly hold up for us now. It's a how-do guide.